Welcome to Calvary Baptist Church, Idaho Falls, where we seek to glorify God, make disciples, and take the gospel to the nations. For more information about our church, please visit www.calvaryidahofalls.org.
God called a man by the name of Abraham, and he said to Abraham that he was going to make him into a mighty nation, that he was going to bless all the peoples on the face of the earth through his people, and that he was going to take them and bring them to a promised land. Now, in the moment when God promised him all these things, Abraham had no children. But the Bible says that Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now, Abraham had a son named Isaac, and then Isaac had a son named Jacob, and then Jacob had 12 sons who would eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel. But when we open the book of Exodus, we have Jacob moving to Egypt because of a great famine. But God had gone before, because even though 11 of Jacob's sons, or 10 of Jacob's sons, had sold their brother Joseph into slavery because they didn't like him, God brought him to Egypt by divine providence to be there to oversee this food program during this great famine. And so Joseph saved his family, saved his brothers. And so at the beginning of the book of Exodus, Jacob brings his family to Egypt, 70 people, far from a great nation. But we see in the first part of Exodus that God allows these people to multiply greatly. So much so that they are enslaved by the Egyptians. Even to the point of Pharaoh saying that all the male babies should be killed and thrown into the Nile River. But they still continue to multiply and grow and grow and grow. And then last week we looked at the story, this particular story of Moses and his birth, and how he was saved by his mom and his sister and Pharaoh's daughter, and raised up in the very household of Pharaoh, only to realize he wasn't Egyptian at all, and that his people were being mistreated and burdened and enslaved. And so he rebelled against that. And he left and he wandered into the desert, and God provided there for him a family. And now we come to these transition verses. I don't know if you've noticed, but in the first 2 chapters of Exodus, God is only mentioned one time. First 2 chapters, the only time God is mentioned is when it says that the Hebrew midwives feared God. Now, we know God is present, we know God is active, we know that God is preserving his people, he's multiplying them, but we don't see God working in these mighty and overt ways. But that's about to change. So we come to this transition from the intro to Exodus to the main body. So Exodus chapter 2, beginning with verse 23. It says, "During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew." The first thing that I want us to see this morning is this desperate cry for rescue. The people were burdened. The people were enslaved. But they cried out to God. God had promised them many things. And God had set out a plan that he was going to enact, and he was going to work. And God had even told Abraham that it was going to take a long time. And that for over 400 years, his people were going to be enslaved in a foreign country, in a foreign land. But one day he would come and rescue them and bring them out with great riches. But I doubt these people felt that promise very strongly in this moment. For generation after generation after generation, they were burdened slaves. with no rights, with nothing, and even their own children taken from them and killed. But they are still, in their desperation, crying out to God. Prayer. What is prayer? I mean, we talk about prayer a lot. Prayer is important in the church. But what really is prayer? I want to give you one word definition of prayer this morning. You ready for it? Surrender. Prayer is simply surrender. It means, God, I can't, but I know you can. I've come to the end of me, and I'm calling on you. Now that's hard for us, right? That's hard for us because we're supposed to be able to do it. We're supposed to be strong. We're supposed to help each other, and we're supposed to raise up and fix all the problems. And surrender is not really in our vocabulary. We're Americans. Come on. But folks, we are followers of God before we are anything else. Prayer is surrender, but I want to tell you what prayer is not. And this is the pattern we fall into all too often. Prayer is not negotiation. Right? I don't know if you've ever tried to negotiate with God. Right? I don't know why we think we can negotiate with God, but we try, right? I mean, all right, God, this is what I want, and this is how I want you to do it. And we list, like, God, you do these things, and then we say, well, God, if you will do this, then I will do this. Right? I'll do these things. So, God, let's work out a plan. Let's work out a deal. Right? And sometimes prayer is a process of God getting us to the point of realizing we can't negotiate. And that we have to surrender. The flow of the book of Exodus, actually the flow of the first 5 books of the Bible, is God forming a nation that will surrender and follow Him. And that's the same thing God's trying to do today with the church. Is He's forming a people that will surrender and follow Him. And we see this play out. That the vehicle that happens for us to do this is through prayer. We come and we call upon the Lord. And sometimes we call and we try to negotiate and then we wait and God doesn't answer because He doesn't want to negotiate. And He gets us to the point where we finally are willing to say, God, whatever you want, I'm here. And God moves and God works and God answers. Maybe not always the way we want Him to, but He moves and He works and He answers. But the problem with the definition of prayer being surrender is that most people have to go to war and lose before they surrender. And God's not the person you want to go to war with. But I see this picture at the end of the book of Exodus, and I also think about Jesus in the garden. Right? What did He pray? Lord, please, if there's any other way. Right? I don't really want to do this cross thing because I know that this is going to be painful and horrible and terrible. If there's any other way, do it. But if not, your will be done, not mine. Surrender. Jesus taught us how to pray. He exemplified what prayer is in that moment. Surrender to the will of the Father. And we see here these people desperately calling on the Lord. And we can see that in our own lives. If we were followers of Jesus this morning, there was a point in time where we became desperate enough to cry out to God for salvation. We've been trying to do it ourselves. We've been trying to fix it. We've been trying to make our life work. We're trying to deal with our own sin and our own struggles and our own problems. And finally we came to the place that I can't do this. God, save me. God, forgive me. God, cleanse me. God, come into my life and be not only my Savior, but the Lord of my life. The desperate cry at the moment of salvation is surrender. But you know what? Also, when Jesus tells us to abide in Him in John chapter 15, right? This process of abiding in Jesus, you know what it is? It's surrender. He said, apart from me, you can do what? Lots of things? Apart from me, you can do everything? What does He say? Apart from me, you can do nothing. So I can be my own little dried up branch on the ground, or I can be connected to the vine with the life of God flowing through me, surrender to His will and for His glory, abiding in Jesus. Right? That's this picture, right? Exodus is pointing us to more than just the Old Testament, to just these people who are going to be wandering around in the desert soon. This is pointing us to God's desire to form a people for His glory and for His self. And you are here this morning because God desires to form a people for His glory. And you're part of that. You're part of His church. And every day God calls us to surrender to Him, to humble ourselves before Him and to cry out to God. Deuteronomy 26, 5 through 9, Moses is writing, right? And he is giving us a perspective from a distance away, right? He's showing us this is what God did, right? And prayer looks awesome when we're looking back on it, right? When you can think back to those days and those times where you're in that desperate situation and God came through and God answered and there was victory, or maybe even it was struggle, but God worked, and you can look at that and you can say, man, that was the hand of God. But it feels a lot different when you're in the middle of it, right? And every day you're crying out to Him and you just don't hear anything, or every day you're asking God for something and He's not giving you what you want. Deuteronomy 26, 5 through 9. This is Moses talking about this same situation. He says, and you shall make a response before the Lord your God. A wandering Aramean was my father. Speaking of Jacob. And he went down to Egypt and he sojourned there. Few in number. And there he became a nation, great, mighty, and populous. And the Egyptians treated us harshly and humiliated us and laid on us hard labor. Then we cried out to the Lord, the God of our fathers. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. And the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and with great deeds of terror and signs and wonders. And He brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now that's a perspective looking back and saying thanks be to God for answered prayer. Thanks be to God to showing up in the moment of our need. But I want you to hear the desperation in the moment. During those many days, the king of Egypt died and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. So if you're in the midst of a moment of crisis, you're in the midst of a moment of struggle, and you're crying and you're praying, what does this say to us this morning that God is doing? You've cried out to God, now what? I want to give you some assurances from this passage this morning of what God is doing while you're crying out to Him. The first thing is this. Verse 24, it says, and God heard their groaning. God hears. Your voice matters to God. Your life matters to God because you are His creation. Now, if you just think about how prayer works, it kind of blows your mind. Right? I can have a conversation with somebody and we can talk and we can discuss and I can hear them if I'm really paying attention, right? Which sometimes we don't do. And we can talk and do all these kind of things. But God can hear everyone all at the same time as they're crying out to him. So I want you guys to help me with something this morning. In just a minute, I'm going to count to 3, and I want you to shout just in your normal voice. I want you to say your full name. First, middle, and last name, all at the same time. Let's do that, right? All right, ready? You got it? Ready? Participation this morning. It's okay. I promise. It'll be all right. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. Matthew Philip McGukin. All right, now who wants to stand up here and name everybody? Now, I know we all got name tags on, but first, middle, and last, man, that's going to be tough. Right? And look, we're about 200 people in this room. But you think about the billions of people who live in this planet, and all at the same time, they can cry out to God, and God hears every one. And it's not about volume. Right? It's not how loud you shout. God can hear your whisper. He can hear you praying in your head. And it's not about length or repetition or any of those kind of things as Jesus taught us in the New Testament. It's simply honest calling upon the Lord. Surrender to him. God hears our prayers. In fact, Revelation tells us that our prayers are so precious to God that he stores them in bowls in heaven. Right? And they're not just like little wooden bowls up under the counter, but golden bowls that are laid at his feet, right? Look, Revelation chapter 5, verse 8 gives us a picture of heaven. We don't have a lot of pictures of heaven, but here's a picture of heaven. It says, and when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. So here's the image that Revelation gives us, that continuously, all day, every day, there are people placing before the Lord the prayers of God's people. Like a precious offering before the throne of God. That's how much God considers you in your desperation crying out to him. You're not an afterthought. God hears. Second thing, verse 24, it says, and God heard their groaning, and then it says, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham. Now, when it says God remembers, it's not like you and I remembering because we forgot. The word in Hebrew that we have here is a covenantal word, like for a covenantal language, right? And actually the word really means that God's deciding to honor the terms of his covenant at this time. Not like God forgot that he had made this deal with Abraham, that he had made this covenant with Abraham, this promise, right? To make him a great nation and to bless all the earth through him and to bring them to the promised land, deliver them from slavery. God didn't forget that. It was just now is the time for him to fulfill his covenant. Right? God doesn't get distracted like I do. I don't know, dads in this room, if you've ever just been like really engaged in something and just that kind of out of the corner of your eye or your ear, you hear this, Dad, 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 Dad. I don't know, it may take 50 times before it actually kind of lodges in your brain that there's somebody trying to speak to you. Right? And the same thing can happen with moms too. I'm not just on dad. Mom. It happens, right? We get distracted all the time. God does not get distracted. It wasn't like the people here in the book of Exodus are crying out to God, hey, remember, we're here, we're down here. Did you forget about us? No. God wasn't busy. He wasn't on a trip. He wasn't watching a television program. It's not that they were trying to get God's attention. It was in this moment, in this time, that God's plan was ready to be fulfilled. Just as he promised. And actually, he told them, Genesis chapter 15, when he made this covenant with Abraham, this is what he said in verse 12. And the sun was going down, and a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. And the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. So when God made this promise to Abraham, he even told him how long it was going to be. And so why are we here at this point? Because it's time. Just like in the New Testament, it says that Jesus was born at just the right moment, at just the right time. God brought his son to earth. Here, at just the right moment, at just the right time, God is going to act. God keeps his promises. God is always faithful. God doesn't forget. He remembers. Right? Just another illustration of this. You guys know what a will is, right? Somebody, is going to leave their possessions and all these kind of things. And sometimes wills are written with full knowledge of the family. Like a mom or dad may sit down and with the family and say, hey, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to write this will, and everybody knows these are the terms. But the will is not executed when it's written, hopefully. Right? Right? The will may be put up in a safety deposit box or in a drawer in the house or something like that. It's not that everybody forgot about the will or even the terms of it. It's just it wasn't time until the person died. And here, it wasn't time for the covenant to be fulfilled, but now it is. So God remembers, God acts because it is his plan. So God hears, God remembers, and then the next thing, beginning of verse 25, it says, and God saw the people of Israel. So God hears, God remembers, and God sees. God knows you. You are not invisible. Now that can be kind of scary sometimes. Right? It can also be comforting that God sees us and we're not forgotten and we're not alone. But it also should be a little intimidating that everything we do and say God sees. Can't hide from him. Right? We can hide from everybody else. But God sees. God knows. Hebrews 4:13, it says, and no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. Isaiah chapter 40, 27 and 28 says, why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary, and his understanding is unsearchable. God sees. He sees you. Your situation is not a surprise to him. Your struggle, your trouble, your triumph, whatever it is, God knows where you are. You're not there by an accident. You're not there because he has forgotten you. God sees you. Good, bad, and ugly, he sees you. And I don't know about you, but to know that God sees me and all my brokenness and all my frailty and all my failings and still says, I love you. Still says, you're mine. Still sent his son to die on our behalf should be an amazing thing. God doesn't just read your resume, right? The good things that you put out about who you are and what you've done. God knows everything. Even the things that you've forgotten and tried to push back or hide. God knows it all, and he still says, I love you, and I've come to rescue you. God knew the failings of these Egyptians. He knew how in so many ways they had abandoned him, these people living in Egypt, in a foreign land, in a foreign place. He knew. But yet he also knew that they were his. And when they cried out to him, God saw them. And the last thing I want you to see, and this one is the most important. It says, God saw the people of Israel, and then it's just 3 words, and God knew. Now, what does that mean? That kind of a literal translation there, and God knew. What did God know? What does that mean? Well, word for word translation, it's, and God knew. But if we were to make an interpretation of the Hebrew words that form the and God knew, what it's really saying is this. God knew, and God wants to be known. So God is going to make himself known to them. And that's the reality of what we see in the very next chapter. What does God do? He reveals himself to Moses. He tells him his name, and he sends him back to go rescue his people. Not only does God know us, right? Because he knit us together in our mother's womb. He formed you. He made you. The very intimate, most intimate details of who you are, God made, God designed. He knows you. But not only that, he wants to be known by you. Do you realize that everything we know about God is because God has chosen to reveal it? Right? Science doesn't tell us who God is. Right? In fact, so much of science is trying to prove that God doesn't exist or that we don't need him. Philosophy doesn't tell us who God is. Math doesn't tell us who God is. Even our own experience doesn't tell us who God is. Now, all of those things can be indicators pointing us to who God is, but it is God who has revealed himself to people who have written it down in this book and ultimately sending his son Jesus to say, this is who I am. Jesus said, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. God revealed himself to us because he wants to be known. Now, I don't know about you. It's a good thing I'm not God, right? Because I'd be up there going, man, those people, they just mess up all the time and I don't want to have anything to do with them. I'm just going to hide, right? But God doesn't do that. God looks at us and our frailty and our failings and he says, I want those people to know me. And I'm going to come and I'm going to rescue them and I'm going to save them and I'm going to set them free and I'm going to gather them together to be my people, to bless the world. So what do we do in conclusion with all of this? This morning, we need to understand that just like these Hebrews in Egypt, we are either once or we are now slaves to sin, oppressed and burdened by our own actions and by the broken world around us. What is the solution? Cry out to God. You say, but Matt, I'm a believer. I'm not perfect, but I'm following Jesus. I love him. But I got some needs. I got some issues. I got some things. What's the solution? Cry out to God. If this verses in Exodus teach us anything, it is the necessity to cry out to God. And when we cry out to God, we can have confidence that our God hears us. He's not busy or asleep. I don't know if you remember the story in the Old Testament with Elijah and the prophets of Baal, right? And then Elijah is going to say, hey, we're going to prove who the real God is, right? And so you build your altar and you cry out to your God, and I'll build an altar and I'll cry out to the one true God. And if your God answers by fire, he's the real God. But if my God answers by fire, he's the real God. So what did the prophets of Baal do? All day they spent crying out to God. They were beating themselves and cutting themselves, trying to get the attention. And Elijah is mocking them. Right? He says things like, where's your God? Is he on vacation? Did he go on a trip? Right? Is he in the bathroom? Right? I mean, Elijah is mocking these people. Is your God distracted? What is going on? And finally and ultimately, after they've done that all day and nothing happened, they're tired and exhausted, Elijah says a simple prayer, and fire falls from heaven and consumes the altar. See, we can have confidence that our God hears us, that our God remembers and executes His promises, that God sees us, that we're not invisible, that He knows us, and He wants to be known by us. Would you cry out to God today? Let's pray. Lord Jesus, thank you this morning for your will, for your word. I pray, Lord, that you will give us the strength and the courage to believe what you have promised, to put our faith, our hope, and our trust in you. And God, in times of struggle that we will cry out to you. In times of triumph, we will cry out to you. We will give you praise. We will give you glory. We will thank you for what you have done. And we will seek to know who you are. God, I pray for each and every person in this room right now that you would meet them exactly where they are, that you would meet every need in their life in Christ Jesus. If that need is for salvation, God, would they cry out to you right now and say, Jesus, save me. I surrender. If there are needs, God, would they cry out to you and say, God, I surrender. Have your will and your way in our hearts, in our lives right now. And may we respond in any way that you called us to do that. In Jesus' name, amen.